Hello, Aurora lovers. This is DaleBoan from DaleBoanImaging, and this is Aurora Hunting 101. This is episode 29. What else can I photograph at night? Most people think about things that are only visible at night as things to photograph at night. You know, anything from stars to comets, those sort of things. But really, there's very few things that you cannot photograph at night. Let's look at some of the night-only objects and discuss what else you can photograph as well. So when people think about night photography, they primarily think about astrophotography, or what people sometimes call astrophotography. I think there's two things. Astrophotography, which is, in my mind, more deep sky things, galaxies and nebula and things like that. And then things that are more nightscape, which is really just a landscape with taken at night where you have stars or Aurora or Milky Way, other things in it. But most people just call that astrophotography. And it can cover everything, as I said, from Milky Way to the stars, constellations, moons, planets, eclipses, northern lights, noctilucent clouds, air glow, zodiacal light. Many, many, many things. Let's take a quick tour of some of the things that you can photograph. And I always need to switch back to this. So the big one is the Milky Way. So Aurora photography is often a gateway to the Milky Way, or the Milky Way is a gateway to Aurora photography, but those are two of the really big targets for night photography. This is a photograph from Waterton National Park, just north of Glacier National Park in the U.S. It happens to be a little bit technical, but it is all just a series of really basic photographs. The weather conditions weren't perfect. You can see there's some clouds in the sky. It's giving it some a little bit different colors, but it's basically just three photographs shot horizontally, one on top of another to get the town, looking down from this overlook, and then up above to get the Milky Way. And then I had to take another picture of just the town at a lot faster exposure and with the camera stopped down so the town was dark enough. Otherwise, it would be just a big white area. This town is much brighter than the Milky Way, so to balance it out, I had to take a separate picture of the town properly exposed for it. But it is just a single, standard picture taken on tripod. There's nothing very fancy with it. As you get into astrophotography a bit more, and the Milky Way, a lot of people buy a tracking mount for their tripod. And pretty much you need a tripod for anything taken at night. Not always, but mostly. That's certainly helpful for almost all types of photography, and especially at night. And a tracking mount is just another thing, basically a motor that you add onto your tripod between the tripod and the camera, and it rotates your camera at the same rate that the Earth is rotating. So the rate that the stars appear to move, so they don't blur if you take a longer exposure. That's all it does. There are some really, really simple ones that don't cost very much, but most of the ones that more serious photographers use are in the $400 to $600 range. Canadian, a little bit less US. Something like this was done using a tracking mount. You can see that it's 160 seconds, which would just blur all the stars. We can see that in the star trails. But, again, the Milky Way. And the other very typical Milky Way photograph is sort of the Milky Way bow. You take a panorama of a bunch of images and you stitch them together. In this case, there's 10 pictures to get over 180 degrees, but you have the Milky Way rising and setting in the north. You have some northern lights that popped up, and then there was a photography group out here learning how to photograph the Milky Way, at least until the northern lights popped up, and then everyone turned around. There's air glow in here, that green glow that's scattered around. That's just the air actually luminesce based on ultraviolet light that had come in during the day, and then it releases that energy at night. And it happens to be, at least the dominant one at the lower altitudes is the same color as one of the colors that's in the northern lights, which can sometimes make them a bit confusing, but you can see the northern lights are in a band, and then the sky air glow is all over the place. I might have said sky glow. Air glow, sometimes called night glow. So a panoramic image capturing the Milky Way. The Milky Way is very high in the sky, reflecting in the water. Milky Way, this is sort of the third type of one. Milky Way is somebody in a picture looking up in the Milky Way, shining a light. Not my favorite, because usually the light is quite a bit brighter than the Milky Way. This is beach in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. That's the Milky Way core, which is the more interesting part of the sky, but it's not really good conditions. It was hazy beach, a lot of moisture. Next after that is, or even before that, sort of one of the big targets is the moon. The moon is actually quite difficult to photograph because it is really bright. And your phone or your camera will probably get it wrong, unless they get better all the time. But generally, they'll look at the scene and see that it's really dark, and then really boost the exposure, and the moon will just be a white blob. That's very typical. If you think about it, the moon is in full sunlight, so the camera settings for the moon actually have to be basically the same settings you'd have during the day. And at night it's much different settings for camera. This one, there's just a crescent moon, so you can get away with blending the two at sunset. This is a moon photo, just the landscape. I actually had to take two pictures because the moon was too bright. So there's a picture of the landscape and another one of the moon, both of them properly exposed and then blended together. You just basically replace the white blob in the middle with the properly exposed moon. This is a moon in eclipse. So it's still pretty bright, but it's not so bright that you can't just take a normal picture of it. And that was with it. This is to get the moon to look that big relative to buildings. You have to have a telephoto image. This was 600 millimeters on a crop sensor, so it would be closer to 1,000 millimeter lens. And this was me, where the camera was set up about a mile away from that church. Same thing, a telephoto shot of this old chimney on a chimney on an old hotel. It's very ornate, and they have an ornate chimney on top of it. Again, the moon in eclipse. This is combining two of those concepts, which is, the Milky Way bow, and then got dark enough. Usually the moon a full moon is bright enough that it interferes with taking a Milky Way image like that, but it was in eclipse, it was being eclipsed, so it's just showing up as a dark red ball. So it was dark enough to get the Milky Way, plus get a separate picture to get the moon properly exposed. In this case, 30 seconds versus 3.2 seconds for the moon. And then all combined together. You've got the Andromeda Galaxy here. You've got, I think this is air glow in here, not northern lights, although that is north. If the sun goes into eclipse, it gets reasonably dark. So this is a from the last total eclipse of the sun. There's an annular eclipse in October 14th, 2023, and then there's another one in, I think, April of 2024, which is a full total eclipse, both occurring across North America. The more southern U.S. for both of those, but the total eclipse is going to go basically right across southern U.S., sort of Texas, Mexico area, all the way up to the East Coast and the islands in Canada in 2024. So you might want to plan for that. Simpler things, nightscape. And then there's two planets here, Venus and Mercury. Just they're always relatively close to the sun. They happen to be very close together that night. They're not always that close together. Again, all the planets the planets are in the solar system is in a pretty much flat plane, and if you get multiple planets, you end up with them in a line. I think there is one down in here, but I can't see it. And then the moon is there, but it's actually quite a bit off that ecliptic line. And then you can just take a picture at night. This is a large valley in Banff near Lake Louise. I was going up there to see these large trees as they turn yellow. But this is the Orion constellation, so there's 3 dots that make up the belt, 3 ones that make up the sword or knife. These are the shoulders, the head's up here, legs. Constellations rarely look like what they're supposed to represent, but this one's a little bit closer. And then just had actually a passing photographer shine a light back across the trees to light up the trees. Otherwise, it's incredibly dark there. And I didn't even have a tripod. I had it set up on some rocks. My camera set up on some rocks. And I had to use 2 pictures because the first one with the lights were sort of cut off at the top of the Orion. So I added some stars from another picture. If you take longer exposures, you can get star trails. We're just waiting for the northern lights to happen. So I was goofing around doing the old way of doing this was on film was to take a long exposure. You do an hour-long or 2-hour-long exposure on film. Digital cameras don't work very well that way. They have digital noise, and that accumulates over time, and it causes problems. So nowadays, what we do is we take a whole bunch of pictures lasting, say, 30 seconds a piece, 20 seconds a piece, and then with software, you can do it in Photoshop, but there's dedicated software that'll do it. I use Star Stacks in this case. It's just 66 pictures, 20 seconds a piece to get those trails. And one of my friends that was there happened to walk through with their light. I could have taken that out, but I thought it added a little bit of interest to this scene. Old Saskatchewan elevator that's still standing, but probably not for much longer once their top roof goes. Same idea. This one's in Alberta near the BC border. I thought it was nice shooting up through the part of the roof there, and I added some lights just to light up the windows and the doors there. Those are just little tea candles. So again, about 100 pictures, 25 seconds a piece. We've got a little bit longer trails there for that. If you apply that same technique to fireflies or lightning bugs, if you want to call them that, you get firefly trails or lightning trails. And if you get really lucky, then you also have a passing lightning storm to combine it with. So wildlife is certainly something that you can sometimes photograph at night, but try and be conscientious about it. We don't want to disturb wildlife at night if they're resting. Like fireflies are active, so they're not going to be disturbed. A meteor coming through. This is taken in South Africa, Drakensberg. the southern Milky Way. The conditions were deteriorating. There's fog coming up from below the Large Magellanic Cloud, which is a sort of a small galaxy that orbits the Milky Way, and then the small Magellanic Cloud here as well. Or more traditional meteor shower technique is to, again, take a whole bunch of pictures with the camera pointing in one particular direction, and then go through and find the ones that have meteor trails in them, and then combine them into one picture. So that's what this is. So there's 15 pictures. There's probably more than 15 meteor trails, and they all point back to, you follow trails back at some place in here is their point of origin. And so that'll be whatever constellation is there becomes the name of that meteor shower. So recently there was the Perseid meteor shower. They all point back, and the point of origin seems to be the constellation Perseus. And there's one for Taurus. There's a Tauroids meteor shower. That's where the names come from, is that point of origin. The space station is passing by. I did this quite a while ago. So it's 20 pictures of just the space station going over. The gaps are about the 1 second between pictures. And then a separate picture just to not have this building overexposed. It's the Canadian Light Source in Saskatoon. So it's a research center. It does a lot of X-ray research. So it's a linear accelerator and synchrotron, I think. Yes. So if you go and try and capture a picture of a comet, this is what you typically get. You get a little green ball. It's only the exceptional ones where you get trails. They have to be fairly close to the Earth, and to be visible to our naked eyes, they have to be really close. I don't even remember which comet this was, but the actual technique for creating this was kind of weird. I was trying to I was using a fast lens for a short period so I wouldn't get any trailing. But that doesn't have a very wide angle of view, so I had to do 24 pictures, so it's probably like 4x6 to create this. I wouldn't normally do that, but that's what I did that time. This is another one with Comet Neowise a few years ago, sitting up there. So it's a cityscape, right? And then we've got noctilucent clouds on the horizon. So this is a HDR picture, so you take multiple exposures of the city because some of it is very bright and some of it is very dark, and to try and get all of that combined together, you use HDR software. You could do it manually, but I used HDR software, from 1/13 of a second to 1/3 of a second. And this is the result. So now you're taking pictures of the city with astronomical objects, right? You're combining different subjects. This is Comet Neowise in Grasslands National Park in southern Saskatchewan. It is using a star tracker, so it's 240 seconds. So there's one tracked and one static one. If you track for that long, the ground gets blurred. So you need to take two pictures, one of the ground and one of the sky, and then you combine them together. Noctilucent clouds over Horseshoe Canyon in Alberta near Drumheller, and the moon had just come up and lit up the Badlands below in the valley. And it's noctilucent clouds glowing on the horizon. Panoramic of noctilucent clouds at Abraham Lake in Alberta. Usually they don't cover that much of the sky. That was very, very unusual. And this is what the moon usually looks like if you try and take a picture of the moon. if you don't do something special with it. Of course, Aurora is there is obviously something you take a picture of. This is a church, very historic church north of Saskatoon. This is in Banff National Park. It's a 2-hour hike to get there, in and out at night. Northern Lights over Saskatoon, combining cityscapes with, Aurora in this case, but it could be something else. Could be Milky Way as well. Steve and the picket fence are Aurora-like objects. I think picket fence might actually be Aurora, but Steve is not the same. With just a camera and a tracking mount, you can start taking deeper sky images. So this is Orion Nebula in Orion. We actually go back. Can I get back to there? That's a ways back. Oops, too far. There. So you can actually see that nebula a little bit here. That's why this pinpoint star is actually fuzzy. It's this region in here that photograph is taken of. There, yeah, so that's Orion Nebula in Orion's belt. This is the North American Nebula, and I forget what the other one is, in Cygnus, just near is that the tail of Cygnus? The Andromeda Galaxy, again, just a camera. You can actually get that probably not too bad with a couple techniques without even a tracking mount. Just take a bunch of pictures and then combine them together in software. But that's a pretty good picture taken without a telescope, 240 seconds and a 165 millimeter lens, or 185 millimeter lens. So it's just a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. If you really want to push it, you can get some of the more distance galaxies. This is the Whirlpool Galaxy. Again, 240 seconds, 4 minutes, 200 millimeters, and it's cropped down. That is just a teeny tiny thing there. Andromeda is huge compared to this one. The Pleiades and passing comet, I forget which comet it was, again, green fuzzy ball, but this is more telephoto, and the Pleiades is one of the more prominent clusters. It's visible in the fall, in through winter, not too far from Orion. Some more unusual things. This is zodiacal light. There's this sort of triangular ray of light that's coming up here just before the sun rises, and we see that most often at the equinoxes, so the spring and the fall equinoxes, and it's going to be dark sky. It's right before sunrise or just after sunset, and you can see the sunlight lighting up the interplanetary dust between the planets. So that's kind of cool, but it's not very impressive. And then just being out at night, you can be in the right place at the right time. I was standing on a beach waiting for it to get dark enough to take a Milky Way picture in California, and these weird things started happening in the sky, and I didn't know what it was, but I took a picture. This is a SpaceX launch just in after sunset, so it's in twilight. It's high enough that the sun is lighting it up, but it was relatively dark. This is the second stage. This is the first stage booster returning, and then there's a couple pieces, I guess, fairings from the separation. But it's just a weird picture, right? Unless you're out there with your camera, be ready to take a picture, you may not get things like that. SpaceX satellites going over after launch is another good one. But there's a million weird things that happen at night sometimes. So what else can you photograph? We talked a little bit about that. Landscapes. My idea of a good night photograph is just a landscape with the Aurora or the Milky Way in it. But it should be a good landscape photo on top of being taken at night. And then architecture, like some of my pictures have buildings in them. And certainly that's something that is good to photograph at night because things are lit up. People, I don't have any of these with people in them, but certainly having people in your pictures, any of the ones that I already had, I sometimes put myself into my Aurora photos. You have to be careful because you can't move, or you need to combine pictures taken at different times, things like that. But people can be hard, but you can definitely put people in them. Sometimes you get wildlife. Had the fireflies, but I've got another Aurora one with a bunch of snow geese sitting on a pond. That's another example, but you can certainly get wildlife. I guess I've got bison or cows, one of those two, with Aurora above them. You can get weather, storms, lightning. Had the fireflies with the lightning, lightning bugs with the lightning behind them. Those can all be photographed at night. But really, pretty much everything that you can photograph during the day, you can also photograph at night. So it's a wonderful opportunity that, not as many photographers tackle. So in addition to all the things that you can see and photograph at night, you can also photograph pretty much everything that you can photograph during the day, people and buildings and some wildlife, not quite as much, but quite often it's in the right situations, you can get wildlife in your nightscape photos as well. But certainly that one requires a lot more care that you're not disturbing the wildlife. It is definitely a photographer's playground. You can create images at night that are unusual and certainly more unique than maybe the more common daylight pictures. It does tend to be a little more technical, just because you're dealing with a lot of certainly long exposures. You typically need a little more expensive lenses that are faster. They can collect more light for your photographs at night. And then a lot of the times you need to take multiple pictures to deal with big differences in the exposure or the brightness of the subjects. For example, even just the picture of the moon, which is really bright, and the landscape is really dark. If you want to have both of those in the image, you generally need at least two pictures, one with the moon exposed and one with landscape exposed, and then you need to combine them together. And then, architecture and cityscapes, you might need to do even more exposures. It is a little more technical. And then for the deep sky photography, the galaxies and the even the comets and the nebula and things like that, which are really small and really dim most of the time, you may need a tracking mount. Also, a lot of people who do Milky Way photography also want a tracking mount to get more detail in the Milky Way. And those aren't crazy expensive, but $400 to $600 maybe for a tracking mount. There are some cheaper solutions, but they require more operator intervention to work, but they're certainly doable. But it is a great time to take photographs. So please check out episode 30, which is going to be a hunt walkthrough. Just going to try and summarize the key steps to doing a Northern Lights hunt. I know I did episode 20 was a crash course, but it's still about an hour. So I want to do a more abbreviated version of that, of just the key steps. So please check out that. And I'm wishing you clear skies and happy hunting.